Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Tzafrir Barzilay to discuss the accusations of well poisoning made against Jewish minorities, in addition to accusations made against other minorities, such as lepers and Muslims, during the medieval era. And we discussed the increase of such accusations and persecutions during the spread of the Black Death, or what was known as the Great Mortality. Dr. Barzilay is a senior lecturer of history at Bar Ilan University. He is the author of Poisoned Wells, Accusation, Persecution, and Minorities in Medieval Europe from 1321 to 1422. He is currently investigating religious practices, and the co-editor of Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Northern Europe from 1000 to 1350, a Sourcebook. He is currently investigating religious practices pertaining to water in Jewish and Christian life in high and late medieval Europe. He is also studying the social and cultural implications of river travel during the same period. Tzafrir, thank you so much for joining with us today. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm always glad to talk about history.
Well, Tzafrir, before we begin, I figured before we discuss the Black Death and anti-Semitic responses and persecution, we would start more so with accusations of well poisoning itself in a medieval urban context. So why were charges of poisoned wells made specifically? Why were some medievals particularly concerned with poisoned water supplies? Why was that such a concern?
So one thing that is important to remember about medieval society, and especially high and late medieval society, is that it's a society with very quick processes of urbanization in pre-modern terms. So the cities are growing fairly quickly. They are becoming more crowded, and more people have to use the public water systems. So as in earlier periods in the 11th and 12th centuries, the cities were much smaller, and there was no organized system of public wells or public fountains. In the 13th century, as the cities became larger and more crowded, city councils started to build public water systems. And it means that people started using wells and fountains that other people that they did not necessarily knew also used. So when you have a well or a fountain in your own backyard, you know who uses it, you know who has access to it, and you can limit access to it. But once it's public, everyone can walk down the street and use it and potentially poison it. So that's not necessarily a direct cause for well poisoning accusations. In many places of Europe, you see these kind of systems. You see them, especially where you have faster urbanization and in places that naturally are more wealthy. So you see them in northern Italy, you see them in northern France, in Champagne, and not in all of these areas well poison accusations started, but it's a precondition. In order to even have well poisoning as a possibility, you need to have public water systems. And this happens throughout Europe from the late 12th century until the middle of the 14th century. You see more and more cities moving from private water systems to public water systems.
I see. So it's really the urbanization and the growth of cities that contributes to concerns about well poisonings.
And concerns about your neighbors, your potential neighbors. The larger cities become, the more you have people who don't necessarily know each other and don't necessarily trust each other, living together in very tight quarters and sharing resources. And this can create, and we see from court records or from municipal records that there are many conflicts between neighbors over the use of water, the use of other resources, pollution, and so on and so forth. So it's not only about using the same water systems, it's living together and not necessarily knowing and liking each other.
I see. I see. Okay. Um, and if I also may ask, most people, when they think of accusations of well poisoning, they immediately jump to accusations made against Jewish minorities in the context of the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. But as you point out in your monograph, there are some very strong antecedents that occur that are examples of well poisoning accusations made even prior to the spread of the plague, and they're not even made primarily against Jewish minorities. Sometimes they're made against leper colonies. Is that correct?
Yes, and I would even say more. Well poisoning accusations started in 1321, and the main minority to be accused are the lepers of southwestern France and Aragon. So there are some Jews who are being accused later in the process, but the main people who are being accused and put on trial and tortured and executed are lepers. And this is very important because it allows us to better understand how the story of the accusations, the narrative that actually justify them and make them popular and make them believable, actually develops. And it develops around lepers and not around Jews. And if we think about it a little more, it actually makes more sense. Lepers in the Middle Ages are a minority who's more and more marginalized and being pushed out of the cities, and their access to the city, to the public sphere, to markets, to water sources, is being more and more limited because their disease is considered very infectious and very dangerous, and they are the people who are considered as possible disease spreaders, people who can actually infect the public. So you can see that the distance from this idea to the idea of mass poisoning is not that large. Jews are not accused systematically of poisoning the public before the 14th century. So the fact that the accusations actually develop around lepers is very important because it determines their narrative. It determines the basic story that is later being re retold and represented in trials and trial records, and officials are sending one another uh, records of trials with this exact story. So the fact that it was created around lepers, it's not only an interesting predecessor to the persecution of Jews, it actually explains how the accusations themselves, the story, was created and designed.
Why were lepers the first to be charged with well poisoning in, as you say, 1321? I know you said that lepers have something of a controversial, or not controversial, but have something of a complicated relationship in medieval era with the general public, because popular hagiographical accounts portray lepers as figures that need aid and they need charity, and they even begin to assemble, as you point out in your book, sort of like in the manner of like religious orders, like their communes, the leper colonies, that they almost resemble like monastic, orders. But but
Yes.
but but why is it that suddenly in the in 1321 do we see accusations made towards them with respect to what prompts this? Did it just come out of the
I
blue?
think you're absolutely right that if you look at the status of lepers in the 12th century or even in the first half of the 13th century, you would see that they are supported by very strong patrons, nobles, confraternities that established leprosies and donate money towards leprosaria, leper houses, and actually support lepers. And this has a strong precedence um, in the depiction of lepers in the Bible, in the New Testament, lepers acknowledge Christ and he cures them. And we have many saint stories in which you have saints curing lepers or caring for lepers. So the lepers have um, they have also positive religious connotations. But the more we move through the 13th centuries, we see the 13th century, we see that lepers are being treated more and more with suspicion. And this has to do with development of the medical literature, focusing on leprosy as an infectious disease, and also with changes with the institutions that are in charge of lepers. So if in the 12th and early 13th centuries, leper houses are under the authority of the local bishop. And as you said, they are kind of a semi-monastic institution. In the late 13th century, you see city councils and local nobles taking or trying to take control over leper houses, the administration of leper houses, the property of leper houses. They sometimes have real estate, they have fields, they have vineyards, they have all kinds of property that the leper houses hold. And we see a local nobility in southwestern France, and especially city councils, trying to take control over the administration of leper houses and control their property. And in fact, in early 1321, we see a group of these city councils writing to the King of France, King Philip V, and ask him to be the official patrons and administrators of the local leper houses. And King Philip pretty much ignores them. And a couple of months later, we see the first cases of well poisoning accusations. And this is not a coincidence, because when you have these accusations, they obviously lead to trials against lepers. And one of the outcomes of these trials is that the property of the convicted lepers goes directly to the officials who judge them. So in many cases, these are the local cities who take over the property and sell it to other nobles. Or in some cases, it's royal officials, officials of the king. But usually in most cases, these are city councils. So there is a political interest of promoting well poisoning accusations, especially on the part of municipal councils of southwestern France and local nobility in these areas. And I think this is what drives the accusations in their initial form in 1321. Later, things change with the Black Death and so on. But initially, this is a political effort to take over the property of lepers. And this is why a new story about lepers appear, because it is created to justify a new political approach or actually political violence against lepers, very extreme political violence, arrest, torture, execution, taking over massive amounts of property. And this needs to be justified. And well-poisoned accusations actually appear as the story, as the narrative that justified this political change.
I see. So all these accusations of well poisoning made in 1321, they're coming out of the context of the motivation for these accusations are really they're political. City councils want to seize the land and the property that all these leprosariums have control over, that they own.
Yeah, that's how I see things, or this is what the documents tell me. One of the problems that we have is that if you read chronicles, if you read historical writing of what happened in 1321, or in general, when you read medieval chronicles, you get the story usually in hindsight. A few years after things already happened, the chronicler would sit down and decide to write a chronicle, and he would try to piece together what happened. The problem is that at this point, the story is already developed. Everyone knows what happened. But the accusation didn't appear as a full story right from the beginning. If you follow court records, for example, you see the story develops over time. The more lepers are being arrested and put on trial, the more elements of the story of mass poisoning, the lepers coming together and planning the whole thing, the spreading of the poison, the preparation for the operation of poisoning everyone, cooperation with Muslim leaders who allegedly supported the whole thing. You see the whole thing develop from one court case to another, one trial record to the next. And this is one thing that the chronicles don't give you. So as a historian, for me, it's very, very important to look at documents that were created during the persecution, court records that were created as the lepers were put on trial and executed, correspondence from one official to the other, letters that were written during the time of the persecution rather than a few months or a few years later.
Right. It's very important to point out that the narrative of lepers poisoning the wells, it starts to grow and implicate sort of other minority groups into the accusations. I know that, as you said, like Muslims are also implicated in the accusations.
Yes, but it's important to notice that in most of the areas that you have well poisoning accusation, and the one exception is the Kingdom of Aragon that has a very large Muslim minority. Muslims are being accused as a literary trope. They are the great enemies of Christianity, and therefore, if there is such a plot against the general public, the Muslims must be involved. But there are no actual Muslims in France in 1321, or there aren't supposed to be. So the idea that the Muslims are somehow involved is an attempt to make the accusations more sinister or more scary,
Right.
as if they needed this extra boost. But this is an element of the story that is created and actually used not against Muslims, but against the lepers. If the lepers cooperate with the Muslims, they must be even more dangerous than what we originally, or what medieval people originally thought they were. When it comes to the Jews, there is a different story. The Jews have a very unstable political position in France in 1321. They're actually expelled earlier in 1306, and in 1315, some of the Jews returned to France. So 1315, 6 years before well poisoning accusations appear. And I think what happens is that after the accusations against lepers appear, some of the nobles of central France try to redirect the accusations and implicate the Jews for the same crime, in order to make King Philip change his mind about the Jews and re-expel them. And we are not sure that the king actually did that, but what did happen is that we know that Jews were put on trial and executed, and many of them, if not formally expelled from the kingdom, at least were scared enough to flee. And there are no Jews, as far as I know, in France from 1321 until much later, 1360.
I see. So would it also be correct, though, in asking what if a lot of these accusations leveled against Jewish minorities in 1321, is this done for a similar motivation that accusations against leper colonies are made? Like are a city magistrates interested in seizing property of Jewish minorities at this time?
I think when it comes to the Jews, when it comes to lepers, I see that the city councils are prominent, but when it comes to Jews, I see more nobles involved, high nobles, or
Okay.
I think when you look at it, it doesn't happen at the same time. You have a wave of accusations against lepers in southwestern France and Aragon for 2.5 or 3 months. And then this wave kind of subsides, or I don't know if it completely ends, but you see most of this wave is over, and then the king recognizes that the lepers were involved in well poisoning. He's actually forced into accepting the idea of well poisoning by his nobles and city councils. And after he acknowledges that, there are nobles of central France who take this idea and turn it against the Jews. So you have two different political maneuvers taking place one after the other. So I think the Jews are kind of a different story. And what is interesting is that when you look at the narrative of well poisoning accusations, in the first 2.5, 3 months, the Jews are not mentioned in any way. It's a story about the lepers, about their conspiracy against the general public. The Muslims are being mentioned, but no Jews. Only after 2.5, 3 months, you suddenly see the Jews being implicated in this thing as kind of a middleman between the lepers and the Muslims. Now, in the original narrative, there was no need for such middlemen. The lepers and the Muslims, according to medieval narrative, were absolutely capable of orchestrating this plot without the Jews. Only after several months, once someone in central France decided that this is an opportunity to get rid of the Jews for good this time, was their name actually brought into the story of well poisoning accusations. So we see political action in both cases. I see major political and economic motivations, but I think we have different players pushing or driving the accusations when it comes to lepers and to Jews in 1321.
I see. And then, if I may ask, what did persecutions of the leper colonies consist in 1321? Did it lead to banishments or consignments to leprosariums? Did it lead to executions? What did the persecutions look like?
Usually, what you would see is one arrest or several arrests of lepers. So when the persecution just starts, they first arrest only particular suspects. So they arrest 2 or 3 lepers, but then they investigate them and threat them with torture or even actually torturing them. And then they provide more names, and before you know it, all of the local lepers are under arrest and investigation. And these investigations can take from a few weeks, sometimes they even take a month or 6 weeks in the longest cases that we know of. And they usually end with most of the lepers being executed, their property confiscated, and those who still remain are being detained in their leprosaria and not allowed to leave. And of course, the administration of the leprosaria is being taken over by city administrators or by local nobles, usually city administrators. So this is how it looks. It's legal violence. They use the legal systems, they use the courts, they use the officials to promote the persecution of minorities. So you don't have, in 1321, you don't have angry mobs or some kind of popular action against lepers. You have a legal system, a legal and bureaucratic system that works against the lepers and actually leads to their arrest, execution, and seizes their property.
I see. And were any of these legal actions taken against other minorities as well, or is it just the lepers at this time? Obviously, there aren't any Muslims in Southwest France, but sorry.
It first happened against the lepers, and then it happens against the Jews. In 1321, you don't have, or I couldn't find a lot of these actions happening against other people. In 1348, during the Black Death, it's a different story, and then you see legal action or legal violence taking place against other minorities, vagabonds, paupers, all kinds of marginalized Christians. But that's later.
Okay, that makes sense. So, Dr. Barzilay, I figured maybe then we could switch from discussing the leper persecutions in 1321 to more discussing the allegations and persecutions of the Jews during the Black Death. If I may ask, um, when did Jewish accusations and persecutions first begin as a result of the Black Death? Were accusations against Jews regulated to South France and or Central France and Aragon? You know, where did this start to happen?
Okay, so this is a little bit of a complicated story because first I should say that between 1321 and 1348, when the Black Death appeared,
Mm,
we don't have or any well poisoning accusations against minorities or anyone else. And if it wasn't for the Black Death, I believe that these accusations would just disappear.
mm,
But what happened when the plague arrives? Then suddenly people are reminded of the accusations that spread 27 years ago, and suddenly make sense because people are dying in very very large numbers. Maybe a quarter or a third of the population is killed by the disease, and suddenly the idea of mass poisoning makes more sense. And then the idea of well poisoning suddenly is brought back to life. Now, as you might expect, the idea reappears in places that it was common 27 years ago in 1321. So the first places that you see well poisoning accusations in 1348 are in southern Europe, in southwestern France, in Provence, in Aragon, the places that had well poisoning accusations in 1321. And,
mm,
at least in southern France, there are no Jews because, as I said, they fled or were expelled in 1321. And there aren't that many lepers either because they were either killed or they were very much limited in their connections with the general population. So these two minorities are no longer a central issue or social issue in southwestern France. So the accusations turn against marginalized Christians, paupers, vagabonds. And this is a period that has many, many people coming from the countryside to the city, many unknown people, especially due to the disease. They're trying to flee the disease, and many of them are fleeing from the countryside to the cities. So the cities are being flooded with unknown people, and a few weeks or a few months later, the plague suddenly appear. So it
mm.
looks as if these people brought with them the plague, even though it's completely untrue. But at this stage, in the early months or in the middle of 1348, the accusations are focused on these vagabonds or paupers that you can find in the cities of that area. And until mid 1348, so for 2 or 3 months, you don't see Jews being accused of well poisoning. You can see popular attacks against Jews. The Black Death, um, if you think about world pandemic, and now unfortunately we can all imagine that, but not a disease that kill 1% or 0.5% of the population, but a disease that killed 25 or 30% of the population. You can imagine the social crisis and the absolute chaos that can evolve from something like that. So the stress and the chaos and the political instability actually leads to attacks against Jews. But these attacks are not justified by well poisoning accusations. They are justified by other reasons, like the fact that the economic activity of the Jews or religious ideas against the Jews. So you have well poisoning accusations and you have persecution against Jews, but one is not necessarily tied to the other. And this is the case until the end of 1348, until September or October 1348. And then the accusations against Jews, against Christian minorities are being linked to the persecution against Jews, and you get the narrative that the Jews poisoned the wells. So you
Right.
have violence and you have accusations, but they are not connected until someone or political, again, lower nobility political agents are interested in connecting the accusations together.
Right.
So,
Right.
as I said, a complicated story. I'm trying to follow that in my book and provide a more detailed picture.
Right. And it's important to, as you point out in your book, that originally that a lot of these accusations that are made during the Black Death, they aren't originally made against the Jewish people, as you've said. They're made towards a sort of Christian outliers, you might say, like the paupers or even the mendicant friars, if I remember,
Yeah,
that are also
mendicant
implicated.
friars, we see, especially the problem with mendicant friars is that they move. So the people who are more likely to be suspected of oil poisoning or many other crimes actually are people who have the opportunity. They move a lot. They can go and poison the wells of a certain area, and people don't know them. They come from a
Mm.
different area. They don't necessarily speak the language. No one knows them, and then they are the target of accusations. But this is what happens in the first, let's say, 6 months of the accusations, from the
Mm.
beginning of 1348 until September or October 1348. And then the accusations, as I said, are turning against Jews. And from that point on, Jews are the main are the main people being accused, and they are the main minority to be persecuted. And most of the victims in 1348, by far, are Jews. And once the accusations travel into the German Empire, the areas of Germany of today, the Low Countries, you see German Jews being put on trial, communities being tried together, whole communities being executed. So it's very difficult to come to exact numbers, but I would say tens of thousands of Jews at least were killed and their property confiscated. It was a terrible, terrible disaster for European Jewry, and a crisis that actually changed the way Jews were organized within the empire. They had to reestablish their communities. It was a massive crisis for European Jewry.
I see. Right. And if I may ask, what exactly is the reason for this shift in accusations towards the later months of 1348? Why are suddenly Jews the main culprit?
So I think what happens is that in the areas of there are two areas known as the Dauphiné and Savoy. It's areas that are today um, Eastern France, Switzerland. Of course, in the Middle Ages, they're not. They're part of the German Empire, at least officially. Um, and these areas are they accept a lot of Jews that are being expelled from France in the early 14th century, and you see tensions of the local nobility and the rulers that want to get rid of the Jews and trying to expel them a few times. Um, and you have people there, political agents who are interested in getting rid of the Jews, and
Mm.
then they use the fact that they are already well poisoning accusations floating around, and you have violence already taking place, and you have the instability of the Black Death, and they use the situation to turn the accusations against Jews. And you see the same kind of mechanisms that I described for 1321. You see public trial, you see trials. People are being arrested, questioned, forced to admit to well poisoning, and after they did, their confessions are being written down and circulated. So you have town officials asking each other, "What do you know about well poisoning accusations?" And they would answer by a short letter and sending the trial records that they extracted from Jewish suspects or other suspects of other minorities. And you have the same mechanism of formal bureaucratic legal persecution that creates evidence, creates trial records that are used in the next stage of the accusations to create further violence in other areas. And in this way, the accusations spread fairly quickly in the German Empire. And in fact, they spread more quickly than the plague spreads. You have the accusation and the persecution of Jews in most areas in Germany before the plague actually reaches a certain area. And in some places, you even have a case of persecution against the Jews. They are either killed or expelled. And a few months later, the plague arrives, and then they would turn against other minorities, marginalized Christians, converts from Judaism, who they suspect are not true converts and are spreading the poison. And then you would have a second wave of violence. So the plague, sometimes you don't need the actual plague to arrive in order to create violence. It's enough that people are scared and are worried that the plague might arrive, and they want to get rid of potential poisoners to push the accusation forward. And when it doesn't work, sometimes you would see a second wave of violence.
I see. And if I may ask, I mean, why were accusations of well poisoning, why were they made in the context of the Black Death? I mean, I ask this because not everyone believed that well poisoning was the reason for the Black Death. I mean, many sort of scholars or doctors believe that it was a cause of miasma or the result of earthquakes or planetary alignments. That they didn't think that well poisoning was the reason for the Black Death, at least not initially.
Yeah, so you have scholars and doctors who don't see mass poisoning as a convincing reason for the plague, and you have political actors that reject the idea of well poisoning, and most prominently the Pope, Clement VI, who actually writes to his bishops and say there is no reason to think that the Jews have anything to do with that. This is a divine punishment for Christian society's sins, and you should tell the people of your congregation, especially the secular rulers, not to persecute the Jews. And he writes 3 letters like that. First, he's very subtle, and the more things progress, he's becoming more and more explicit about the idea that the Jews did not poison the wells. But you have to remember that this is a time of extreme chaos. Not only you have the Black Death in Germany, you actually have a civil war going on. You have 2 different emperors or people who wants to be emperors fighting with each other. You have great political instability. So in this kind of situation, even if you have a prominent leader calling to stop the violence or talk against certain kind of accusations, you sometimes have local dynamics that people from above just can't control. And you also have political leaders who are very interested in inflaming accusations against Jews. If you take the example of the city of Strasbourg, for example, that I went very, very deep into in my book, you have a city council that is interested in protecting the Jews, and you have an opposition that actually wants to use well-poisoned rumors against the Jews to attack the ruling council. They basically present the idea that the ruling council only protect the Jews because they are being bribed. The Jews pay them to protect them, and then the opposition pushes the idea that the Jews are actually well poisoners, and that the leaders, the local leaders that protect them, should be expelled. And they actually use this argument or other things as well, but also this argument to create a change of government, to create a rebellion against the local government. And after the local government is being expelled and the new government establishes itself, then the Jews are being executed. So sometimes you have different interests of different political leaders and different religious leaders. And I think the plague played a major role in the fact that the leaders that called for violence or called for change of government were actually able to prevail.
Mm.
Crisis is, or political instability, social instability, major disease is creates an unstable situation in which extremists can rise to power.
Right. Right. No, it's very interesting the way you point out that many times the the accusations of well poisoning they're used as a tool of political undermining, so that they undermine ruling officials and their authorities. This is saying that you know that they're being bribed, but as you said, by Jewish minorities, and accusations of well poisoning sort of take on a life of their own apart from the Black Death, where it's more of a use as political leveraging against ruling officials.
What happens with the accusations? One of the questions that I try to ask in the monograph is, why did these accusations disappear? As I said, they are extremely common in the 14th century. They spread across Europe, not everywhere, but you find them in Aragon, you find them in France, you find them in the Low Countries, you find them in the areas of like modern day Switzerland, in the German Empire, and they go as far east as Poland. You find them across Europe. They're very, very common, but for some reason, they disappear in the second half of the 14th century. And by the early 15th century, you can find very, very few cases of well poisoning accusations against minorities, and almost no cases of people being put on trial and executed for well poisoning and their property confiscated and all of that. So it was very, very common in the 14th century and suddenly disappeared. And I tried to understand why. One explanation is that the Black Death doesn't disappear. You have the first major outbreak from 1348 to 1350, and then the disease continues to reappear every decade or so in European cities. And when you have the disease in the second outbreak of the disease, you still see persecution against Jews, and the more the plague returns again and again, you see less and less persecution and accusations against minorities, because people eventually understand that it doesn't matter if a certain city got rid of its Jews, killed them, expelled them, or other minorities for that matter. The plague still continue to appear, even though the Jews or other minorities are no longer there.
Mm.
So the idea that someone poisoned the wells suddenly make less and less sense. And also, when you have such a crisis, when in the first instance that you have this disease that no one knows and kills thousands and thousands of people, then obviously you have a more extreme reaction than when you see this disease and you already know it, and it's part of the reality of medieval people's life. And it actually became part of a late medieval reality. People knew, or they were not, they tried to prevent it as much as they could, but they couldn't actually prevent the Black Death from reappearing every decade or so in their cities. And they realized that eventually that the Jews had nothing to do with it. And then the accusations kind of turned from a legal explanation or a legal justification for persecution into a story. Of course, you still have anti-Jewish feelings, and you still have writing against minorities and against Jews in particular, and then chroniclers or other writers, literary writers would use the memory of the Black Death in 1348 to claim that the Jews are the enemies of Christianity. but you don't see actual trials. You don't see actual people, actual minorities being arrested and put on trial for well poisoning. So there is a very big difference between an idea that spreads through chronicles and literature and informs society, but doesn't actually create violence. And my focus in the monograph was about how ideas create violence. And sometimes you have violent ideas, but you don't have the social or political circumstances that make these ideas translate into violence. And what I try to do in the book is follow or try to describe or understand the political and social circumstances that make some ideas or well-poisoned accusations in particular create or allow or justify violence in certain circumstances. So that's the main the main project that the book is trying to achieve.
Right. No, I mean, but there might already be sort of I don't know what word to use, but a sort of general suspicion or hatred for for minority groups and Jews in particular. But it's not until these particular cultural or social or political circumstances arise that you start to see violence emerge as a result of those ideas.
Yeah, you see violence, but sometimes you see violence being justified by other means. For example, you have major persecutions against Jews in the German Empire from the late 13th century, and in many cases these are justified by host desecration accusations. And the idea that the Jews took the Eucharist, the consecrated host, somehow stole it and desecrated it, tried to burn it, tried to stab it. And for medieval Christians, this is an attack against the body of Christ. In medieval theology, the Eucharist is not a symbol of the body of Christ. It is the body of Christ.
Right.
And attacking the Eucharist is attacking Christ himself, or reenacting the crucifixion. And this is a very strong justification of anti-Jewish violence before the Black Death. But you see, when I, as a historian, I see violence, but I see that it has a different dynamic. There you have different actors being involved, or different stories put forward to explain the violence. Then my tendency is not to say, okay, this is the same thing, they just found a different excuse. I try to ask, why did they come up with a different excuse? What changed? Where does new ideas against minorities come from? And for well-poisoned accusations, one of my conclusions is that this story develops around lepers and not around Jews. And therefore, it doesn't have this religious narrative at its base. It's not created or not constructed like a crucifixion story, because it was originally constructed to convict lepers. And lepers are not considered to be the killers of Christ, and they don't have all of these narrative baggage that the Jews have. They're actually presented, as I said, fairly positively in the Bible. So the story actually matches lepers, but in the reality of the Black Death, it was fairly easy to direct it against Jews. So this story, if you would take the story of well-poisoned accusations and put it 30 years earlier, then it would make less sense. And indeed, it disappeared after 1321. If it wasn't for the Black Death, it probably never reappeared. But in the reality of the Black Death, it suddenly made sense again.
Right. And then if I may ask, Dr. Barzilay, how exactly did ruling officials, maybe in central or southwest France or in Germany, how did they respond to these persecutions? Were there any attempts to suppress or quell anti-Semitic persecution or activity in response to the plague? I know you mentioned how the church and Clement VI took a very negative stance on the question of well poisoning, saying that it's a fictitious lie. But did anyone else attempt to quell anti-Semitic persecution?
Yes. There are cities in Germany. Cologne, for example, never accept well poisoning accusations. They ask around. They write to other cities and tell us what kind of evidence do you have? Have you arrested anyone? What do you know about this? And they write several times to different cities, and they're not convinced that the wells were actually being poisoned. But eventually, the Jewish community in Cologne is being attacked not by the city officials, but by the people, the public, who turn against them. In Regensburg, for example, the municipal council was able to protect the Jews completely in 1348 to 1350. And they actually, when they heard about well poisoning accusation, they organized together and got all of the representatives of local noble families sign an official document saying that they are not going to persecute the Jews and that the accusations are false. And it actually worked. When you have wide enough support of local officials or local nobility, then you can, and they were able to stop anti-Jewish violence, even though in other places in the area Jews were executed. So yes, you have examples of local officials who makes different choices and are able to withstand this general drive to act against minorities. But the general rule was that most official governments, most local governments, most urban governments were not able to prevent the violence, and some of them didn't even try. Some of them were very happy of the opportunity to get rid of the Jews. It depends on the local circumstances, and these change. But still, you have officials that acted against the accusations, sometimes even successfully.
I see. And if I may ask, how did medieval chroniclers, chroniclers writing, several years after the fact, after the allegations and persecutions, how did they frame the narrative of persecutions, if I may ask? Did they think that the claims were substantiated? Did they think that they were false? Was there a sort of mixed bag where some chroniclers think that the allegations were justified and some weren't? How did that work?
Most of them think that the accusations were justified, but not all of them. You have a few chronicles that usually those who wrote closer to the events, who are more sensitive to local nuances. You have a chronicle from Strasbourg who says the reason that the Jews were executed was because of their economic activity. And because he knows the dynamic, he was there, he lived through the events of 1349 in Strasbourg, so he knows the local dynamics and he's more sensitive. The more chroniclers are farther removed from the events, the more they tend to just make very wide statements of all of the Jews were involved and they were all executed. But chroniclers who lived through the events of the Black Death, some of them are more skeptical. Still, the majority tended to accept the accusations and tie the accusations with the plague. This is the general rule.
I see. Well, with on the side of chroniclers that were skeptical about these accusations, did they ever see ulterior motivations in the charge of poisoned well allegations?
They see political motives. It's very, very clear that the Jews are a minority who that needs protection. Jews need royal or imperial protection, and this is the case through the High Middle Ages. The Jews are involved in economic activity that is considered a sin from Christian perspective. Offering interest offering loans for interest is considered a usury. It's forbidden from a Christian religious perspective, and the Jews practice this kind of activity, and it draws all kinds of negative feelings toward them. So the Jews need protection. Without protection, once you take away their protection, then they are going to be attacked either by local leaders who wants to seize the opportunity, or sometimes by the public. So it's very clear to people in medieval Europe, to chroniclers or otherwise, that without the official protection of the local ruler, Jews are going to be in a serious trouble very, very quickly. They all know that. It's very clear that their interests to get rid of the Jews or attack the Jews, economic interests, political interests, and it's very clear that the accusations have the power to take away from the Jews the protection, the political protection that they usually have. The only question for these chroniclers is whether this is justified. Did the Jews actually poison the wells? And most of them answer yes, but some of them answer absolutely not. This whole thing is false.
Right. And then when do we start to see the persecution of Jews as a result of the Black Death die out? Do we ever see a decrease in anti-Semitic violence as soon as the plague subsides? Because obviously
we see a decrease in well poisoning accusations. It doesn't mean that there are no other kinds of accusations. Host desecration accusations don't die out. I think the 15th century or ritual murder accusation, the idea that Jews would kidnap a Christian boy and execute him, these kind of accusations don't die out in the 15th century. They actually continue to thrive and continue into the early modern period. Well poisoning accusations, because they don't have this religious narrative at their base, and because they are very much tied to the Black Death after the first outbreak of the Black Death, they died out because they make less sense. But other accusations continue, and we see action or formal actions against Jews in the 15th century. This is the century that we see many areas in Germany and elsewhere in Europe expel their Jews. The Great Expulsion from Spain in 1492, for example. So the 15th century is by no means a century in which anti-Jewish feelings die out, but well poisoning accusations do. And for me as a historian, this is something that calls for an explanation.
Right. But with respect to because obviously after the Black Death subsides, the plague itself flares up again every few decades or so. But even though that it flares up, you don't see a resurgence of these accusations of well poisoning. People sort of think that's
because they make less and less sense. If you see something, if you have a cause and effect, and you see that the effect happens sometimes with the cause, sometimes without the cause, then the connection, the causal effect connection comes into question. And think about Europeans who see the disease reappear again and again in cities that have no Jews. Then the idea that Jews created or caused the disease just doesn't make sense anymore. So it doesn't happen in a day. It takes several decades. But by the early 15th century, you find very, very few well poisoning accusations, actual well poisoning accusations, not as an idea, but as an actual people being arrested and put on trial.
Right, but because this is still a popular idea in the imagination that during the plague, the Jews were responsible for poisoning the wells. Like I think in John Mandeville, there's like this one story.
But that's a literary trope. Okay. When someone writes a chronicle or write a literary text, they're going to turn to their sources of inspiration. They're going to cite other chronicles. They're going to turn to popular stories. They have no obligation or desire even to present things as they were. They're trying to tell a good story, and this is a good story. Obviously, if it wasn't a good story, you wouldn't be asking me to make to have this interview today.
Right.
This is an interesting story, so people keep telling it. It doesn't mean that they are convinced that this is what happened and this is what's been happening.
I see. So, if I may ask about some of the long-term effects of these persecutions during the Black Death, what would you say are some of these long-term effects? Did Jewish refugees ever attempt to rebuild communities as a result of these persecutions, or what does that look like?
Yes, and there is a lot of research being done into that right now, but what happens is that in many of the cities, especially in Germany, Jews are being expelled and are not allowed to come back. So in some of the cities, the Jews reestablished their communities, sometimes in a different location, with a different center. They sometimes build a new synagogue, and so on. In other places, they are not allowed to return, so they establish themselves in the countryside. My colleague Deborah Kaplan did a very, very interesting work on the area of Alsace, where Strasbourg is, where the Jews create a network of very, uh, very, very small communities, minor communities, like one or two families in each village, and they are still able to create a communal life through communication between these communities. Um, but things change dramatically. Uh, Also, it has to do with where Jews live, with the way they organize their communities, with their connections to the local authorities, and these things change dramatically after the Black Death. And I would say that if you look at at the history of European Jewry, then it makes a lot of sense to divide between the High Middle Ages, from like the year 1000 to the Black Death, and from the Black Death onwards into the early modern period. This is an actual breaking point between medieval and late medieval or early modern Jewry.
I see. Well, Dr. Barzilay, this has been of a very interesting interview. If I may ask, maybe as a closing question, what books would you recommend for us who'd want to learn more about well poisoning accusations, but even sort of anti-Semitism in the medieval era in general? I know that your monograph, we've alluded to it in an interview, and it's a really very, if I can say, it's a very good book on the subject of well poisoning.
I think I would recommend two books. One is by a scholar named Magda Tetel about blood libels, and she follows the development of blood libels, of the idea that Jews um, attacked Christian kids, boys, and executed them. And she follows this idea from the Middle Ages into the 20th century. So you get a very, very long perspective of how idea develops and creates violence over time. That's one book that I would recommend. And another book is called No Return by a scholar named Rowan Doring. It was just published a month ago. And this is a monograph about expulsions and the way to justify expulsions in the later Middle Ages, not only of Jews, but of other people, Christians as well. So this gives you a perspective about how minorities are being treated, or how foreigners are being treated in late medieval Europe, even beyond the geography or the chronology that I described in my book. Um, yeah, that these would be my two top choices.
Right, right. Well, Dr. Barzilay, this has been a great interview. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.